Morning, everyone. Let's take a few moments and greet one another. Why don't you turn to your left, to your right, in front, behind you. Say good morning to somebody this morning. And if you've not, if somebody you don't know, introduce yourself. We're glad that you're all here this morning. If you're visiting for the first time, I want to give a special welcome to you. Welcome to Life Point Church. We're glad that you are here, that you are worshiping with us this morning. As we start our time this morning, I want to ask you, have you ever experienced something in your life where you look back and you could say, man, that was God's perfect timing? Look back at a situation, and maybe at the time you didn't understand it, but now when you look back, you could see God's hand working in that situation. For me, I can think of a time when I was living in the U.S., living in Memphis, and I was a young church planter. I was probably around 24, 25 at this time, working and planting a church in Memphis. And the Lord opened the door for us to work with different immigrant communities that were moving into our city. And one of those immigrant communities was a group of Bhutanese Nepali, or Nepalese Bhutanese people. Okay, so they are people who grew up in Bhutan, but they're ethnically Nepalese, okay? And so if you know some of their story, they grew up in Bhutan, and because of some government persecution, they were forced to leave their country. They went back over, across the border over to Nepal, where they lived in refugee camps for 20 years. And after a long time, they were able to relocate to a third country, came to the United States starting in around 2005, 2006, and so a group of, several families moved to Memphis, and this is right around the time when I was planting this church, and they happened to move into the apartment complex right next to our church in our neighborhood. And so the Lord opened a door for us to begin to do ministry among these people. And I remember at that time thinking, I don't know anything about Bhutan. I don't know anything about Nepal. I can't speak the language. I don't know the culture. How am I going to reach these people? I know Pastor Lao, okay, and that's about it, okay. I know Lao culture, but this was cross-cultural work for me. So I was praying to the Lord, and I said, God, how am I supposed to reach these people? What do you want me to do? How am I going to plant this church with this group of people? At the time, I was going to seminary, and I actually worked at the seminary. At that time, I was the custodian at the seminary, right? And so I had the keys to everything. And one day, I was at work and cleaning, picking up the library. And I walked in, and there was this new student, older guy, new student, and he was sitting at the table, one of the study tables. And as I was walking past, he said, "Hey, excuse me, sir, excuse me." And I said, "Yeah, can I help you?" And he had a question about the library, where to find something or get something, whatever, right? So I said, "Oh, okay." I helped him out. And then I started, trying to get to know him. I said, "Hey, what's your name?" He says, "My name is John Sharping." I said, "Oh, well, it's nice to meet you, John. Are you new here to the seminary?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm doing my doctoral studies." And I said, "Okay, cool, great. Well, where are you from?" He says, "Actually, I spent the last 10 years in Bhutan and working with, and then in and out of Bhutan and Nepal." And I just my heart just stopped, I was like, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've been a missionary there for all these years, and I'm back in the States, doing my doctoral work." And I said, "Could you help me out?" And so John, over the next several years, he and we would go into these communities, and he would basically on-the-job training. He would teach me how to share the gospel with people in Nepalese and Bhutanese. He would teach me all about the culture and the language and all that. And so we spent the next several years working alongside one another. And so I look back and I think, man, God's perfect timing. God's perfect timing. But that's not it. God continued to show me during these years, right? Because there was another wave of immigrants that came, and they were from Burma. And there were, people, different people groups, some Chin people, Kachin people, from coming from Burma. And again, I was like, what am I going to do? I don't know any of this, the languages. And again, I was in the library. The library is a good place to go. I was in the library, and I saw another new student. Right, he was an Asian guy, and so he looked kind of lost. So then I was like, hey, can I help you out? He's like, oh yeah, I'm new here. He's kind of speaking broken English. Well, where are you from? He's like, I'm from Burma. And I said, wow, that's awesome, man. What are you doing? He's like, I'm Kachin. At the time, I didn't know what Kachin was, right? So he's like, so we got to know each other. He joined our church. He became a part of our church. And for the next several years, he also helped me to reach the people who were coming from Myanmar, coming into our city. And then so our church, over the next several years, became this mix of Nepalese, Bhutanese, people from all over Burma. And so I look back at that season and that time, and I could say, man, God's timing was perfect in those two specific incidences, right? Like, you look at that and you say, is that just a mere coincidence that I just happened to be working at the school at that time? These guys happen to be sitting there. We happen to strike up these conversations. No, we look back and we say, God's timing. And today, as we continue through our series in the book of Esther, as we come to Esther chapter 4, we're going to see that truth throughout this book, that God's timing is perfect. As we've been studying the book of Esther, we know that God's name has not been mentioned even once. And in fact, the name of God is not mentioned throughout this entire book, but we can see that his fingerprints are all over this Esther story, right? That he is moving the pieces. He's in the background, moving the pieces to bring about his great plan of redemption. So if you're joining us for the first time, we're going to do a quick review. We try to do a quick review every single week, right? This is the story so far. The king of Persia got rid of his queen, and then there was this kingdom-wide search for a new queen, and the criteria was that the new queen must be young and must be beautiful. And out of all the young and beautiful girls throughout all the empire, a young orphaned Jewish girl by the name of Hadassah was chosen. Her Persian name, of course, we know is Esther. So Esther becomes queen, and yet throughout the story, her identity has continued to be concealed. Nobody knows that she is actually Jewish. The king doesn't know that she is Jewish, right? Shortly after this, her older cousin, the man who was raising her as his own daughter, his name is Mordecai, he begins to work in the king's court, and he gets into some trouble at work with his boss, right? His boss is a man by the name of Haman, whom the king has ordered everyone working for Haman to bow down and honor him. But Mordecai decides that he doesn't want to do this because Haman is an Agagite, and he is a descendant of the Amalekites, who are long-time enemies of the Jewish people. And so Mordecai says, no, I'm not bowing down to you. And so Haman is furious. And not only does he already have this hatred for the Jews, but this particular Jew was not bowing down and giving him honor. And so Haman goes on this campaign to annihilate and to exterminate all of the Jews from throughout the kingdom. He gets authority and permission from the king himself. They put out a royal edict that says that on the 13th day of the 12th month of the year, that everyone throughout the kingdom was given permission to attack, to kill, and to plunder any Jewish person throughout the kingdom. This is like a scene from the movie The Purge, right? And so here we are in our story. God's people are in trouble. An edict has gone out that is calling out for the extermination of all the Jews throughout Persia. And the queen is actually in trouble because she's Jewish, right? Nobody knows it yet. The king doesn't know it yet, okay? And so, but what's going to happen here in this story? Again, God's name has not been mentioned yet. It's not mentioned in this story, but don't be fooled. Again, his fingerprints are all over this story, right? And so nothing here is random. Everything is happening in God's perfect timing. So we're going to read in chapter 4 today. We're going to read the entire book, so if you would follow along with me. Let's see what happens next in this story. What is going to happen? Because now we're in trouble. God's people are in trouble, okay? And what is Esther going to do? How is God going to use Esther? Okay, starting in chapter 4, verse 1 of chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth. but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Chapter 4 is my favorite book, my favorite chapter of this book. It is sort of the pivotal point of the story, right? Everything sort of has been rising up to this point, and then we finally get to, again, the pinnacle of the story here. It's a chapter where everything starts to come together. It's a chapter where those pieces that I've been talking about, mentioning over the last few weeks, how God is working behind the scenes, moving these pieces. This is a chapter when those pieces begin to fit together. We begin to see why things are happening. Why did some of the Jews remain in Susa when they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem? Right? Why was Esther taken from her home and put into the king's palace? Why was she chosen to be queen out of all the other young girls who were in the program? If you think about it, why is it that an orphaned young Jewish girl is now the queen of Persia? Why are all these things happening? Why did she conceal her identity? Why is Mordecai working in the king's courthouse? Why is Haman so fixed on destroying the Jews? Why are all these things happening? Chapter 4 begins to answer some of these questions. I want you to keep in mind that Mordecai, Esther, all these people in the story, they did not have on hand the book of Esther to find out how the story was going to end, okay? Remember that they didn't have the luxury of knowing the end of the story, right? Now we do, we're reading back into it, but for them, as they go through it, they don't know that they're about to be rescued. All they know is an edict has gone out. What is going to happen? How are we going to survive? Don't you wish you knew the end of the story, of the stories in your life? Don't you wish that you could know how things will turn out? You go into a situation and you, God, would you just show me how things are going to turn out so I can just take the right road, so I can know which direction to go? That would be great, right? It would make life really, really easy, right? It would make making the right choice in every situation really simple. There's a saying, that hindsight is 20/20. You guys ever hear that saying? That when you look back, everything's clear, right? You see it and you're like, oh, I get it. That's why these things happen. When we look back, it's so much easier for us, for those of us of faith, it's so much easier for us looking back to see how, what God was doing. But in the moment, what we can often feel when we're going through something in the moment is we can often feel dazed, and we can feel confused, and we can feel discouraged, those 3 Ds, right? We can feel doubtful, we can feel all these things, right? That when we're in the moment, we don't have the end of the story to our particular situations, right? And so what do we do while we're going in the moment? What do we do while we're going through it? as we're feeling discouraged and we're feeling dazed and we're feeling confused and we've got all kinds of questions for God, what do we do in this moment? This morning, I want to share with you from this chapter 3 things that I believe that we can do as we are seeking to understand and really make sense of what God is doing in our life. The first thing is this: to seek refuge in God. Seek refuge in God. Go with me again to verse 1 through 3. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out in the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to go into the gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and decree was reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. What did Mordecai do? What was his response to the decree that destruction was coming? He turned to God. He sought refuge in God. As soon as this edict went public, it says that he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth. Okay, imagine like a potato sack, okay? He put on sackcloth, he poured ashes on his head, he covered his body with ashes, and then he went out into the middle of the city, right? And he cried and he wept, covered in ashes and sackcloth. Now, if this sounds strange to you, okay, you might be wondering, is he having a mental breakdown? Like did he reach a certain point and his mind just went crazy? Because this sounds strange to us, right? Like if we saw on the news, that in the middle of the busiest intersection in Bangkok, that there was a guy out there and he wasn't dressed in normal clothes, but he was wearing a sack, okay, and he's got ashes all over him. Today, in our modern society, we would say he's lost his mind. He's having a mental breakdown. But back then, this was very, very common. Okay, this was a very common expression of grief and mourning back in the ancient world. This would have been as common as us wearing black when we go to a funeral, right? When you see a group of people walking out of a wat here, okay, and they're wearing black, you're like, there was a funeral there, right? Like you don't have to guess, right? Because that's a very normal thing. So back then, if you saw somebody wearing sackcloth and with ashes all over them, it's a sign of mourning. It was a sign of repentance. It was a sign of lament. It was a sign of grieving. And for the Jews, beyond just grieving and mourning, it was a sign of an expression of crying out to God. Crying out to God. This is how they cried out to God in prayer. This is how they were saying to God, God, we need you. We need your help right now. It's really hard what we're going through right now. Folks, I want you to understand, as you read through the scriptures, as you read and see how God's people respond to times of crisis, and as you read some of the Psalms and you read what King David wrote in his expression, in his prayers to God, I want you to see that it is healthy and it is good to cry out to God. Yes, God created us with a mind to reason and to think, but he also created us as creatures with emotions and with feelings. For me, this is where I probably lean towards the reason and logic side. For me personally, whenever I face a problem, I want to find a solution. Anybody else like me? Okay, I'm like, what's the solution? I don't have time to feel. I don't have time to be sad. That's just how my mind works, right? I'm always like, I got to fix it, okay? And so this is where I'm like, God, help me to feel a little bit more, right? Like, help me to also respond by coming to you first. God created us with emotions and feelings, and when we experience conviction of sin, when we experience pain, when we experience loss, when we experience grief, God wants us to seek comfort in him. God wants us to seek refuge in him. God wants us to turn to him, first of all. He wants us to mourn. He wants us to express our emotions to him. He wants us to cry out to him. He wants us to be very real, and he wants us to be very honest, and he wants us to be very transparent. Why should we hide anything from God? He knows what we feel even before we express it to him. He already knows it all. He wants us to express our anger to him. He wants us to express our frustration to him. He wants us to express our sadness to him. Psalm 55:22 says, cast your burdens on the Lord, and he will sustain you. Seek comfort and refuge in him, right? 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. This is a verse for those of you who deal with anxiety, right? Like, cast your anxieties on him. Why? Because he cares for you. Let me ask you, are you doing that? Is that how you respond to life situations in your life? When you deal with grief, when you deal with loss, when you deal with trials in your life, how do you respond? Do you immediately try to find a solution? Do you immediately go to something else? Do you try to drown out your mourning with something else? Do you try to distract your mind and yourself from your situation with something else? Or do you turn to the Lord? Or do you go to him seeking refuge and seeking comfort? Or you move to prayer, right? Do you seek refuge in the promises of God, in the truths of God? God's people are not promised to be immune from the world's troubles. We will go through it, but God has promised his presence. He has promised his peace, his joy, and his strength for us to go through all circumstances. And because God's timing is perfect in our lives, we can know that there is purpose for every pain in our life. Disaster doesn't get the final say, and heartbreak only lasts for so long. God's purpose will be revealed. Romans 8:18 says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed in us. I hope this brings comfort to those of you who may be going through some suffering right now. That what we experience right now is not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. This is the hope that we have as followers of Christ, as God's people. God's people, we don't fall apart and melt when things go wrong. No, because we have the knowledge and understanding that God is in control. That we believe that he decides how the story ends. And that we may not understand his timing, but we know that he's working out everything for our good and for his glory. So when we don't fully understand what God is doing, let's still seek refuge in him. Turn to him. The next thing that we see in this story that we can take from is that for us to not only seek refuge in God, but to seek the hand of God. See where God is at work in the situations that we are facing. Mordecai was out in the city. He was out in sackcloth and ashes, and he makes his way all the way up to the king's gate. Now, he's not allowed to go beyond the king's gate because there's a dress code in the king's court. Now, what really it is there were laws back then where you couldn't be sad around the king. How about that, huh? Yeah. History records certain accounts where people were severely punished for even frowning in front of the king. So you ain't going in there with sackcloth and ashes, man. You know what I mean? And so he's mourning. He's out there in his mourning clothes, and he goes up to the gate, and he's just out there in front of the gate. And so word gets to the queen, Esther, your cousin is outside, and he's in sackcloth and ashes for some reason, okay? Now, I want you to understand something. Esther has no idea what's going on. She has no idea that an edict has taken place. She has no idea that a decree has gone out for the destruction of her people. She was very much insulated inside the palace. Okay, concubines and queens, they were kept secluded from what was going on outside of the palace. Part of it was that rule that they wanted to keep these women happy and not stress about what's going on, but they were secluded, okay? These girls weren't on their phones scrolling through, their phones all day in the palace, okay? They didn't know what was trending on Persian TikTok, okay? They didn't know what was going on, right? So Esther here, she sees this happening with Mordecai, and she's like, what's going on? Why is he in sackcloth and ashes? So then she sends her people out, and she sends them out with a pair of clothes. Hey, get my cousin some clothes so he can change, so he can come in, so we can talk about this, okay? So she sends the clothes, and he's like, nah, I'm not taking it, right? And so then she's like, all right. So she sends them back and says, well, then try to find out what is going on, what is happening. Verse 7, verse 8. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Not only that, he also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So what's happening right now is they're playing a game of telephone, okay? They're not really talking directly. She's sending her assistants and talking to Mordecai. They come back, they give a message, they're going back and forth, all right? And so she now receives this news from her assistants. And not only does she receive the news, but she got to read the actual written decree, and she reads it and she realizes how serious this situation really is. The destruction of her people. And so Mordecai told the assistant, you've got to plead with Esther. You've got to beg her. Tell her she's got to go see the king. And just beg and ask that he would take this back. Now remember Persian law. Once a king makes an edict, it cannot be revoked. So he's asking her to do something that's impossible. Okay? But you've got to try, Esther. You've got to try. You've got to go and you've got to beg and you've got to ask him to spare your people. This is, again, no small task. You don't just go walking in to see the king unless you've been summoned. In fact, there's a law that states that if you go and see the king, if you just walk up there and knock on the door, you just present yourself to the king without his personal invitation, without him extending his scepter out to you, there's a law that says you will be put to death. And yes, that includes his wife too. We saw what he did to Vashti, right? And so what Mordecai asked Esther to do was very, very dangerous. It was a very risky and very dangerous thing. It wasn't, hey, could you text your husband for me? Like, it wasn't that, right? It was like put your life on the line here and ask him to do something that is impossible because we're desperate. Desperate situation here. So she reminds him of the law. She says, hey, don't you know that this is dangerous? And she adds that and in fact, I haven't seen my husband in 30 days. Like, he hasn't even called me in to see him for 30 days. Now you want me to just waltz right in, right? And just do this and just walk in? This was not an easy decision for Esther. This was like a death trap. But Mordecai was not giving up. Okay, he's got faith. He's not giving up, so he challenges her. He says, okay, Esther, I want you to think about it from another perspective. So check out what he says, verse 12. They told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do you not think to yourself that even in the king's palace that you're going to escape any more than all the other Jews? For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows? And this is the line, the most famous line in all the book of Esther. This is the one everybody remembers. This is the title of our message today, the title of our series. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. He's talking about timing, God's timing. He's trying to point her to see a different perspective, to see it from God's perspective, to see how God's timing is working out. And his reply to Esther really displays great faith in the promises of God and in the protection of God. He says to Esther, you've got two choices here. You can stay silent. You can say nothing. You can continue to conceal your identity and your Jewishness and just go about your business and enjoy your life in the palace. Pretend like nothing is happening. Go back to your sheltered, privileged life, ignoring the plight of your people. But you know what? I believe that even if you do that, if you stay silent, God's still going to deliver his people. He says, rescue and deliverance will rise from another place. See, Mordecai, he knew the stories. He knew the story of how God delivered the Israelites from Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. He knew the story of how they defeated the Amalekites and how they took down the city of Jericho by walking around it 7 times. He knew the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who 100 years ago were delivered from the fiery furnace. He knew the story of Daniel, who refused to stop praying to God, and he went into the lion's den, spent a night there, and the lions did not attack him at all. So Mordecai believed, and he knew that God was a way maker. He was a miracle worker. Some way, somehow, he was going to make it work. He says, Esther, you're our best shot right now. God has placed you in this position for such a time as this. But Esther, even if you don't do this, I believe God is going to figure this out. God is going to deliver his people. So Esther, are you going to do this? Because even if you don't do this, you know what? He's going to find someone else. He's going to use someone else. But Esther, think about it. Do you think it's a mere coincidence that you're the queen of Persia right now? An orphan Jewish girl, you are the queen of Persia. Can't you see God's hand in this? That's what he's saying. Do you not see God's timing this? Do you not see how all these things are lining up? God is up to something, and he's got you in this particular situation in your life, in this particular position for a purpose. Esther, there's a reason you were born a Jew. There's a reason you were part of the people who remained in Susa instead of going back to Jerusalem. There's a reason why God made you beautiful. There's a reason why you were taken from your home and thrown into the palace. There's a reason why you are the queen. You are placed in this position by God to be the deliverance of God's people. God has planned this out from the beginning of time. God's timing is perfect. We must seek the hand of God over our life and over the situations in our life. Instead of just asking, God, why is this happening? God, why am I going through this? We need to ask, God, where are you working? God, show me your hand in this. Show me how you're weaving these things together. God, how do you want to use this to help me grow in you? We must seek the hand of God. See where he is sovereignly at work. All right? So when we're in these situations, seek the refuge of God. Seek the hand of God. And lastly, we must seek to do the will of God. Seek to do the will of God. Mordecai helped Esther to see the hand of God in her life. He helped Esther to see that God was moving these pieces of her story, and now she has to respond. It's one thing to just recognize where God is at work in your life. It's another thing to accept it and be obedient to what God's calling you to do. Now that she has this information, now that she knows what's going on, because before she was in the palace, she didn't know about this edict, but now that she knows, she is now accountable for her actions. She's accountable for the things that she's been given, the influence that she's been given, the positions that she's been given. She's now accountable to use that for the glory of God. So Esther understood that God had placed her in her position for such a time as this. Verse 15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. Although it's against the law, I will go to the king, and if I die, I die. If I perish, I perish." So Esther responds, and she says, "Okay, I'm going to do it. But could you do something for me? Because this isn't easy. Could you pray for me? In fact, could you organize all the Jews throughout our city? And could you guys fast and pray for me for 3 days? Because this is not easy. But I will go to the king. And with your prayer and with your fasting, I will go to the king. And whatever it costs me, I'm willing to pay the cost. If I die, I die." Folks, early on in our series, I was pretty hard on Esther about her concealing her identity, not standing up for her faith, right? But this Esther that we see here in this part of the story, this is no longer that young girl who just went along with the program just to survive. This is no longer the young girl who's just trying to, hide her faith and keep her identity hidden. She's now willing to come out, not only as a Jew, but she's willing to put her life on the line for her people. She now stands among the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. She now stands among Daniel, who says, "I will not bow no matter what. That I believe that God is going to protect me and care for me." And so she is now in a different place. She's now willing to be obedient to God. I love that she didn't just go in her own strength. She asked for prayer. It's not always easy to be obedient. Whenever you face a difficult situation in which you've got to be obedient to God, and it's going to take a lot of strength, won't you ask for prayer? Ask for prayer from your friends and from your community, right? She knows that this is going to be a difficult thing, and yet she chose to trust in God for the consequences. Seek to do the will of God always, in every situation, and trust God with the consequences. You see, if she does nothing, her people will perish, and she will perish. If she goes to the king, it's very likely that she will perish. I believe this is why she says, "If I die, I die." Okay? Like, she knows that both choices could very likely end in her death. And so she says, you know what? Since it seems like I'm going to face this either way, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to do the right thing. And if I perish, I perish. Church, are we committed to do the will of God no matter the cost or the consequences? Are we willing to do the will of God always in every situation? Are we willing to say, you know what? This is what God wants me to do, and if I lose my friends, I lose my friends. This is the right thing to do, and if I lose my job or if I lose this promotion, then you know what? I'll lose my job and I'll lose my promotion. You know what? If I do this and it's harder, it brings more hardships, so be it. I'm going to commit to do the will of God. I'm going to continue to trust God. I'm going to continue to walk with God. I'm going to continue to be obedient to God no matter how difficult it is. And if I die, I die. Esther faced her moment, and she made a decision. What about us? What about us? This morning, I want us to take some time to reflect. As we close our time together, as we reflect on chapter 4 and reflect on what we've talked about this morning. I want to ask you, how is God speaking to you today through this story? And how does he want you to respond? Maybe you're going through a season in which you're really struggling to make sense of what God is doing in your life. And maybe this morning what God is calling you to do is seek refuge in him. Find comfort in him. A lot of times when we go through hardships, we want to turn from God. We want to run away from God. And folks, let me tell you, the best place you can be in times of hardships is in the arms of God. Even when it's difficult to get to that place, right? But turn to God. Don't turn away from him. Turn to him. Seek refuge in him. Instead of hardening your heart against him, turn to him. Yes, mourn. Yes, cry. Be angry. Be frustrated. Be sad. Just turn to him. Seek his presence and seek his peace. Maybe this morning God wants you to see where his hand is working in your life. He's orchestrated the details of your life up to this moment. Maybe it's a job that he's given you. Maybe it's the relationships that he's put you in, the influence, the opportunities that he's given you. And in response, he wants you to be obedient to him, to leverage what he has given you for his purpose. I want you to take a look at your life and say, the place that I am in, the position that I am in, the things that God has given me, how has God worked all that in my life, and what does he want me to do with that? Like Esther, he has placed you exactly where you are for such a time as this. Sure, God can raise someone else up, but his plan will still prevail, and he wants to use you. He wants to use you. You're a teacher. You're an administrator for such a time as this. You're a classmate for such a time as this. You're a friend or a coworker to somebody for such a time as this. You are a parent. You're a neighbor for such a time as this. Like Esther, step up and be obedient no matter the cost or the consequences. Let's pray together.